Hello and welcome to Switch 2020. I'm Saina Denugara from India. I've been a career journalist, a TV show host. I ran a very popular show in India on startups and entrepreneurship. And that really got me thinking about getting my hands dirtier and working more closely with both the investment community as well as startups in the country. And I switched over to heading up branding, marketing, and community at Let's Venture, which is one of India's largest fundraising platforms for startups. Now, it's an absolute pleasure for me to host a session on the future of women entrepreneurs. This is a topic that's really close to my heart, and I look forward to welcoming the panel. So, let me just do a quick round of introductions before we jump into the conversation. So first, let me introduce Gina Romero. She's the CEO and founder of Connected Women, which is essentially an organization that works with corporate partners, local organizations, government agencies in the region to boost women entrepreneurship. Then we have Chloe Lim, who heads up the APAC marketing group at Facebook. And Chloe has been involved with Facebook's activities for many, many years. In a role prior to this, she was with PayPal. And lastly, let me introduce Betty Yang, who's the managing partner at 500 Startups, and she oversees 500 startups, ecosystem development programs in the region, as well as strategic partnerships, and actually just getting the whole funding ecosystem in the region going. So welcome, everyone. Gina, Chloe, Betty, wonderful to have you here. And I know I did a little bit of an introduction, read out a line of your bio, but I don't really think that tells us very much about who either of you is. So let me ask each of you a little bit of a leading question to really understand who y'all are and what motivates you. So if you can reflect back and think of in your career, what has been that one big inflection point or that one big pivotal point, and tell us about that so we really understand your journey so far.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So I have kind of an interesting story, I guess, because I don't come from a tech background at all. In fact, my first proper job, I was cabin crew for British Airways. I wasn't very good in school, so I didn't get a college degree, and I barely made it through high school. But I met my husband when I was flying, and we started up a small business together doing buying and selling online. And then I went back to flying, and we started building remote work solutions so that I could work while I was, still doing my flying job. So that's kind of how I got into tech and fell in love with the potential for tech, especially for creating remote work opportunities or location independent setups for women.
All right, interesting. Chloe?
Hi, everyone. I'm Chloe. I head up global customer marketing for Facebook and all our brands across APAC. Thank you so much for having me. I am looking forward to the session. Saina, I think I was very lucky. My inflection point came quite early in the career. I took the road less traveled. When I graduated, most of my peers, my contemporaries joined big MNCs, and I joined a little internet startup. Bearing in mind, this was about 20 years ago, most people did not know the internet. They asked me, how do you make money from it? How does it work? So I actually took a big risk. And to provide some context, I actually came from a pretty underprivileged background. I was one of 5 children to a widow. And I've never been overseas before. I don't even own a passport. But with my first job, I left for Hong Kong to set up a business there. And then that just set me onto a path. It took me to different countries. It gave me courage and confidence to take risks. And it set me on my career journey. Then shortly after that, I found myself a founding member of OTA, an online travel startup, and this time round in Australia. When we ended up selling the business, I stayed on after the founder left, and I ended up running the business across 16 different countries in a foreign country, and I was barely 30 years old. So I think my first role was really critical in setting me up. But it's important to highlight that I only had my career because education and technology was a great leveler for me.
All right, interesting. Betty, you want to tell us a little bit of your story?
Hello, everyone. Betty Yang, managing partner at 500 Startups. Reflecting on inflection point, it's also a bit of like I would call it like unknown, but at the same time, it wasn't really planned. I think some people plan to go into venture or become an investor. Some people are really excited about that. For me, it just happened. But also I had to like really work my way in. I am Chinese Brazilian and in the Bay Area, right? So I had like no connection whatsoever. I wasn't also looking to come into venture. But I was working working a lot with entrepreneurs, but entrepreneurs are not in tech. So they were working a lot in handicrafts. So it's more in the fair trade space. And the thing I always wanted to do, we were working with 40 different indigenous communities in the Amazon rainforest. And the thing that was in my mind is there has to be a way to scale the impact. So that was like so driven in my day to day that I was trying to find the solution of how do we empower not 1,000 people, but tens of thousands or like millions of entrepreneurs that are in different parts of the world. So I started with that question, and that question ended up putting me very close to the tech community. And then eventually, that was about 12 years ago, I entered the Silicon Valley tech community. So it wasn't really expected, it wasn't really planned, but it has been a really amazing journey of a lot of like fitting in and finding my own voice and how to build sort of further resource out for all the entrepreneurs in different parts of the world.
All right. So I think one common point that all of you brought up was how your introduction to technology became a sort of leveler for each of you, right? If you just want to maybe go one step deeper and if you want to reflect on what that actually means, right? What level playing field does technology create? And I also want to kind of circumference that by saying that everything said and done, the presence of women in technology is still quite limited, right? The number of women who take STEM or tech in their education much lower in all parts of the world. In the US, in India for sure, in the Southeast Asia region as well. So talk us through what motivated you to actually pick up that education in technology or that introduction in technology, and what you would advise women very early in their careers.
So happy to jump in to try to reflect that common thread on that. I think there is one component that it has been really important as an enabling factor is sort of this constant obsession that I had, and I think I recommend also entrepreneurs and people coming into this field. It's building networks and building networking, right? So the reason I was sort of invited in was because I had this very early touch point to the network. And then I constantly thought about how can I contribute with my own voice that it's different to this network, and how do I continue to build on that? So it has been extremely helpful in my entire career, especially when you need to sort of switch, but you normally would, like, you put in a lot more before you take out in that network, but they come in handy over and over in my entire journey.
Yeah. Hey, really amazing point there. I wanted to say that it was similar kind of tech being an enabler. I was thinking about why did I go into tech? I think the first thing is that generally, and I say this for everybody, is that you do have to seek out environments where you can flourish. And I certainly seek out environment where I can flourish. And what it means for me is that it leverages my strength. It makes me feel empowered. It makes me feel like I can do my best job. And for me, that type of environment very frequently is kind of tech related because it is fast paced, it's very empowering, it's pretty open, and there's always lots of problems to be solved. And I don't mind a bit of ambiguity. So for me, because I'm a problem solver, I see the light in something that is very difficult. So I find that just seeking out environments where I can flourish helps. And to me, the tech environment was suitable for that. But I also wanted to, when we talk about leveling, right, and how to be successful in workplaces, there are, as what we've talked about, there are other factors in it. I think that the other thing that is really important is really the people that you work with, right? Just now we talk about networks. It's also about having allies, mentors, advocates, and they could be your manager, your peer set, people you network with, or your team. It's just really having a network to lean in for ideas. Having diverse opinions to things is really important, to learn, to connect, and frequently to advocate and champion for you as well. The other thing I found really interesting is that I've also been in really diverse and inclusive companies. Yeah, and I was very fortunate in all the kind of internet and tech companies that I've been with. They were really conscious about diversity and inclusion. Like for Facebook, I think most people know our mission is to give people power, to bring communities and the world closer together. Similarly, we're trying to build a workforce that is as diverse as the communities that we serve. We pledge that over 50% of our workforce will come from underrepresented groups. So I think joining companies who have heightened sense of inclusion and diversity, and more importantly, kind of are taking systematic steps to make real changes is really helpful. So if that's aligned to what you personally believe in, you can thrive in it. So hopefully that's helpful.
Okay. Gina, for you?
Thank you. I'm really happy that the topic moved to community quite early. I mean, as a community builder, I've been building women's communities for the last 15 years. I actually joined a women's community back in the early days. So, you know, when I said that I was flying for British Airways, and then my husband and I started a buy and sell business. And this was just a small home business that started to take off. And so, you know, it got to the point that my husband quit his job so that he could focus on that. And I was still flying. And there was a point where we suddenly felt overwhelmed. I mean, we didn't really know how to run a business or set up a business, but we were already doing business. And I was invited to attend a women's networking lunch in the local town, and I went along to that, and I was shocked. I'd never heard of networking, apart from the IT type of networking. I met women there who were, you know, just starting out. I met women who were coming from extensive, you know, management careers in corporate, who had quit their corporate career and started up a business. And in many ways, despite our various different backgrounds, we were all there for a common thread, which was just to figure out how to start up a business and to learn from each other. And I think, you know, that really planted the other side of me, which is my community builder side. And, you know, from there, I've taken that thread through everything that I've done. And the tech part, the funny thing is I didn't see myself as a techie, really. I mean, I really saw my husband as a techie. But when I joined the community of women, I realized how techie I actually was. I was even kind of known as the girl geek of the network, which was quite funny because in my team of engineers, I was the least techie one, you know. So that's where I found that passion for really helping women leverage on technology, because I found that women limit their dreams. You know, even though they've had big careers, success, and, you know, run huge teams, when they start up their own business, they suddenly start limiting it to just them or maybe two people. And it led me to wonder why women who had big ambitions in corporate setting would suddenly, you know, cut their dreams back right down to sort of just a one-person consulting business. And the more I sort of tried to understand, I realized that it wasn't the lack of ambition. They just didn't have the know-how to scale up. And so I began advocating for technology as a means for them to, you know, scale up a global business, even if you were working from your kitchen table. And today that's, I think, more true than any other time.
All right. I think you know, one common thread that's come through, of course, in each of your comments is actually pushing your own boundaries, right? Getting out of your comfort zone and then finding an environment that makes you comfortable and then thriving in it. Betty, for you, right? You reflected on your Brazilian Chinese makeup, right? And definitely not easy to break into the culture in the Bay Area. You know, just anecdotally of everything that we've read over the last couple of years, it has become, you know, there is that stereotype, and it's a stereotype for a reason, right? So tell us about, you know, that pushback that might have been there and how you negotiated it.
Yeah. So the negotiation, it's more internal than external. So there's definitely a lot of difficulties that stand ahead of us, but it's your identity and your understanding of your identity that's the most important part, right? So for a really long time, born as immigrant in Brazil, I always wasn't sure if it was Chinese or I was Brazilian, and then my confusion further complicated when I came to US. So the negotiation is internally when you come to conclusion. It's actually both. So a lot of the strength that I thought it was not a strength before, that was my shortcoming, I realized that my biggest strength is to become translator, right? Like when we think about opening platform, opening communities, is understanding one side of the language, understand another side of the language and culture, and then find that common bridge. So for the longest period of time, I always thought I have to become one of them or one of the side. And then eventually I realized actually my biggest role is accepting me with this sort of differences and the capacity for overcome over and over the differences between people and find that common ground. So once that negotiation internally settled, I think that becomes so much easier and becomes like a practice muscle that you come in. And at the beginning, for instance, in the negotiation, I was afraid to like tell my opinion. And then later on, with the stereotype we have here in the Bay Area, of course, the tech community also can be very broad. Like it's also just really finding the voice, finding ways where you can reinforce really the message, and also throughout the work and the results that I think represents for itself. So I think the negotiation, often we think it's externally with other people, but actually the negotiation is with each of us.
All right, that's interesting. Gina, just to kind of continue this thread with you, to your mind, creating a women's network can be very empowering, correct? But is there also, do you reflect sometimes on the flip side of what it does, perhaps create sometimes a little bit of a silo for women to operate in? And what are the workarounds for that, right, that you have done for connected women and in the other communities that you've built, so that it doesn't, these networks that are really strong don't function as something of an outside, a strong community, but something that remains peripheral and not part of the mainstream? Because that's sometimes a problem that can creep in, when you create networks around gender or race or any of these other factors, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, like in any sense, our perspective is only as big as our worldview, right? So, I mean, even on platforms like social platforms, if you have a very limited number of friends and you follow them and you see their views all the time, then you begin to believe that that is the view of the world, and it can be, it doesn't necessarily reflect the truth. So I think, like any network, you have certain networks for certain things. I mean, I landed in this women's network. It was never intentional for me, but I'm so glad that I found this network, because there are definitely certain challenges that women have that I think, discussing together and overcoming together really helps. But to be perfectly honest, none of the women's networks that I've been part of have been very gender specific in terms of our content. So Connected Women runs tech events. We ran the first women's edition of Startup Weekend in Asia, or in Southeast Asia at least, and that was in Singapore back in 2012. And it was just like any other startup weekend. It had the same topic. We didn't sort of pink wash it. We didn't make it female-centered topic. We didn't change the format. Nothing was changed. It was just that we wanted to get more women into that event, because globally Startup Weekend has a very poor representation of women. I think at the time it was something like 10%, even in the US or in London. So I think it's important to build these communities to address where there is an imbalance and try and understand where the imbalance is. But let's not make women's products and women's branding and women's sort of events just for the sake of it, because that also annoys me when I see that happening.
Chloe, you want to reflect on this from your career and from your role presently at Facebook as well, in building out communities that are not siloed, right? And echo chambers.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because I've built most of my career kind of whether in startups or in corporations in APAC. And if you think about it, APAC is actually a really dynamic region. It's evolving so quickly, both economically and socially. But at the same time, we're here speaking about it because gender gap still exists, right? And it's so nuanced because there's so many factors. We know that women are still relatively lower representation in leadership positions. So I think McKinsey's Power Parity report in APAC says that there's only one woman in leadership position for every 4 men. So that there is gender disparity and gender gap that continues, and it's an issue that we need to continue to have attention and resolution for. I think because the issue is so nuanced, it's across all areas, right? Every party, whether it's kind of on a policy side from government, on a company level or individual level, that we can all play a part. And Betty was really talking about, hey, as individuals, how do we change the mindset? And as I go through my career, many of us have this from time to time, and I still have that imposter syndrome, right? How do you overcome that? And then how do you surround yourself with the right people, much like what Gina has mentioned, to really help champion, but challenge the ideas and improve your world perspective. So I'm hoping that as we go through the years, we'll actually have less of this panel, because that this gap is continuing to decrease, but there's so much more that we need to do to address this situation and issue.
All right. Speaking of gaps, so the one big gap, right, that exists and especially relevant and important in the context of startups and entrepreneurship is capital and funding, right? So lots of speed bumps, lots of speed breakers on the way to creating a company or creating an organization. But when it is paucity of capital, and especially capital that has been kept out or denied because there is a gender lens at function, it pinches, correct? Because large businesses can be built by any individual. And I'm just going to read out, some numbers just to contextualize this for the audience as well, right? So a 2019 report by Crunchbase actually found that male-only founders raised about $200 billion in 2019. Female-only founders managed to raise just about $6 billion, right? So 195 billion versus 6 billion. And then companies that had female founders with male co-founders raised about 20 odd billion. Right. So it kind of just reinforces perhaps that somewhere in the venture capital industry, like Betty was saying, there are closed loops, networks. There is definitely different lenses at play. So Betty, you want to talk us through what you've seen from the front lines, right? Decode these numbers for us. And to your mind, what do they actually stand for and represent?
No, thank you for bringing the statistic, especially when you look at during COVID time, the number further sort of dips, right? So when you look at this quarter, Q3 actually 2020, there was a significant drop. It's almost 50% drop on funding to female founders, right? And a big component, we actually ran a survey with 200 of female founders, and like a third of them said it has been really, really difficult to run the business. And then at the same time, like manage their sort of family members and the personal part of it, right? So all of a sudden, the challenge that you mentioned, that it's already very sort of pervasive in the venture, in the capital component, had a further down during COVID. And especially, we also know majority of the founders, when we sort of did the survey with them, 56% really still trying to fundraise, right? So there is that component of the challenge of the timing that gets really accentuated. And I think like that's what often happens with crisis, just like shows further where the gaps are. I think answering your question on how do we sort of maybe fulfill the gap component or from a capital component, there's also sort of proof out that when you have investors, women investors sitting in the decision component that actually increase their portfolio side, right? So I think there's a big component, and there's more and more a push of the funds having more diverse investment committee. So I think that's one component to look at the solution. And then internally at 500, I think there's a component that we think it's really important is building that connection. During COVID, one of the biggest challenges, you used to go to events, you used to be able to meet new investors, but with the distance, now it's even harder. So we built out this global hub for female founders to build out these connecting tissues between the entrepreneurs, the mentors, and the investors. So we believe that it's really important to help build additional resources for female founders. But when we think about funding component, we try not to immediately in the short term say we have a quota within the organization, right? We don't have a quota to hit, but we need to ensure other things. We need to ensure we're in networks. We need to ensure we're in the building sort of hubs and connection, amplifying the voices that has been working. And then over time, we have seen improvement in our investment activities by changing the team, by focusing on the team and the decision, by focusing on building really strong networks throughout. So a little bit on the statistics side, the industry has on like less than 13% of the startups have gotten funding, right? We're talking about startups with funding that has women co-founders. And then within our portfolio is a little bit double of that, right? So it's significantly better than the industry, but there's still a huge gap for us to get to 50-50. So I think there's a lot on the capital component. There's a lot of work and influence actually the capital can do. I think partially it's deploying really the capital to the founders, and then another part of it is how to further build out resources, especially when we are doing early stage at 500. We can connect a lot to downstream capital and follow on.
All right. There's also, yeah, Chloe, come in.
So now I was just going to build on what Betty talked about, kind of the impacts of COVID and the pandemic. I know it impacts all lives and livelihood, but the reality is that the pandemic has a regressive effect on gender equality, right? So women are more disproportionately impacted. And Betty was giving us the lens from a capital standpoint, but we've seen stats like the World Bank said that they've seen more female-owned businesses closing during this pandemic than men's. And McKinsey basically said that, hey, women made up 39% of the global employment workforce, but it's accounting for 54% of the overall job losses. So certainly kind of the trend and the impact of COVID, women are shouldering a disproportionate burden of that. So I just wanted to kind of add on to it.
All right. Okay. Just one point that I wanted to circle back to Betty on, and then bring in Gina actually to reflect from the other side as an entrepreneur. Betty, there's also a trend in the Valley, and perhaps you can talk to us about the trend here in Southeast Asia as well, of dedicated funds, right? And they might not be as large as the Accels and Sequoias and the first rounds and the benchmarks of the world, smaller funds that have, a very targeted thesis, right? Whether it is investing behind Black women or, African American entrepreneurs, or whether it is platforms like Jane VC or Aldrace that only want to fund women-led businesses. Do you see some of that? Where do you think that will go? What's your sense of what that will do to the ecosystem in terms of even nudging, limited partner or LPs into, where they're putting their money and why they're doing it? And what reflection of that trend from the Valley do you see happening in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so we built out, it's interesting because we've been seeing a surge in the funds, like you mentioned, with targeted audience, targeting underrepresented groups. And the first thing that we've seen on this trend, and it's been like the past 5 years, so we built out this program for investor education to share a lot of our knowledge called VC Unlocked. The first few participants that came was looking a little bit of that thesis. And like 5 years ago, we thought it might be really difficult to raise those funds. But in the first class that we put together for education, we have Sogal Capital, which is a really good fund that originally were targeting more like women, young women, millennial, and now Asia, and now it has really broadened the thesis to invest in like the next generation, right? And they have like invested now in better and better companies. So that proves itself that's working. And then you have the first generation of funds, just as Sogal. In parallel, in that same class, we have Arlen Hamilton that joins. She built for the Black LGBT community. Also, she has like from sort of coming into the class to be at the sort of Fast Company front cover. I think it's getting really a lot of momentum. I think that trend is going to different parts of the world as well. And the beauty of that is they're getting a lot of exposure, although that is a lot of vanity metric on exposure, but they're getting really good deal flow with that. Because to be really good in funding, you want to find the best entrepreneurs, and people like to see things that are in the media. So it's creating, I think, really important fundamentals so that they're successful in their current fund. So sometimes I see super competitive deals that will have them in the cap table. They would have, because the entrepreneurs, and Gina can speak a lot more on that later, also want like not the traditional funds. They also want like a diverse view in that. So they've been really being able, and I think that's what really gonna lay the foundation is when those funds are performing. It's gonna take some time because it's an early stage fund. So it takes time to see the vintage working, but I don't think it's just the media or it's just a trend. I think that trend is allowing to build out foundation where these funds are going to find really good entrepreneurs and fund really good businesses, and then it's the fund to sort of perpetuate in their fund 1, fund 2, fund 3 to come. And I do think that that is not just in the US. I think that's a trend that we're going to see throughout the world, including in Asia.
Yeah. And true enough, right? It's only over the next 7-8 years that we'll perhaps see the next set of unicorns being born, right, out of these funds. And then that will actually be really good signaling and role modeling, right, for entrepreneurs, because we are also used to seeing a very typecast unicorn founder, right? I know a couple of women there who IPO'd their companies only over the last year, but still a very small number. So Betty, over to you from the other side, right? What is, yeah.
Just to add, like you were mentioning on like reference, that for sure, right? Like in the portfolio now we have 7 unicorn companies that have women co-founders, and it really brings like the next generation as inspiration. So for sure, we're quite positive on the outlook. Gina.
All right. Gina, over to you from the other side.
Yeah, so we are a social impact tech startup, and we're still, in the early stage, and we've pivoted now for many reasons that I won't go into now, but we're now focusing on training underserved women and upskilling them for jobs in AI. So we've kind of moved away from our original direction, but we're still focused on the original mission, which is helping women get access to incomes that they can earn from home. So, and I think I have to say, from my perspective, that's a really an important distinction, that we started with a problem and we've been on the road to trying to find a solution to the problem. And I think it seems kind of obvious, but that is the nature of a social entrepreneur, right? As opposed to starting with a possible solution and then looking for your customer who might want to buy this solution. So, we have had some challenges in many different ways. I have to say, I guess at this early stage, because most of our investors are, angels. So we're just raising small amounts of funds for now. We have been up until now. We haven't so much come across the challenges in the bigger space because we're not there yet. But just in the sense that we're a social impact tech startup has already given us a lot of challenges. I don't know if it's an Asia specific thing. And maybe Betty can touch on this and answer the question, but certainly here in the Philippines, there are people, philanthropists or big foundations or, just investors in general, angel investors who are interested in investing, but they find it hard to marry together the idea that you're a for-profit startup that wants to make money and scale, but also you're focused on impact. And we've literally had the question from some investors at the end of the pitch saying, well, I don't get it. Are you a charity or are you a business? Because you can't be both. And for us, it seems so obvious that it makes great business sense to create impact in our work, right? And to be sustainable and so on and so forth. But, it just seems for some people hard to grasp that you can be both and make that happen. So I don't know if this is this a Philippines thing? Is this an Asia thing? Or is this just a global question?
Betty, Chloe, you want to reflect on that?
It is a global question. I think there's still a divide today on putting if it's or sort of this underlying like, oh, maybe if it's impact, it's not going to make money. But I think often we need to help people shift paradigm. I think when we started the conversations, a lot of our job on helping people show like the future, like what got you here is not going to get us then. And I think right now, the new generation, like I think the difference is like when we pitch the super rich people into that, they live in the old generation. The new generation, if you are working with the Gen Zs and all, they all want purpose. I go to work, they all ask you about purpose. I was just like, what purpose? Find tomorrow. They're like, no, like I want purpose. Like I want brands that makes that difference. So I do think that the new generation is going to drive very successful business, but I just think sometimes it's hard for us to shift that paradigm. And then a lot of our job, and especially your job, is to find that intersection and help show some of the cases. And once people start seeing it, I think it will come.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, it's not a privilege of Philippines.
I was going to say that I also agree with Betty that I think it's a global issue. It's not specific to a particular market, and it relates to shifting of mindset. But I think there is light at the end of the tunnel, because I agree with the newer generation. There is people want purposeful brands, people want to serve the community, but it will take a while before we can start to shift that mindset.
I was obviously born too soon. But actually, I think, other than being a generational thing, which I definitely agree with, I think this is also a gender thing, right? So, almost all the women that I've met who've gone into business, almost all in 15 years, have not started a business because, they planned it out in their life necessarily, but they came across a problem that they were personally experiencing, and they solved that problem, and they wanted to bring it to other people that had that problem. I mean, that is kind of the definition of entrepreneurship, right? In really, but it isn't always like that. I find that sometimes entrepreneurship has become very manufactured. Almost like the music industry, right? There's the musicians who make music because they love music, and then there's those who pander to the sort of commercialization of a market. And so it's almost like a factory, like a cookie cutter factory of building startups and pushing them out there and making money. And I don't know if that's my perspective again, but I think that, women definitely come in with that sort of purpose because they're trying to solve a problem that they want to solve for themselves.
So
Gina, sorry.
No, go ahead, Chloe.
No, Gina, I was just going to say that it's really interesting because I think there's been so many unicorns and success story of entrepreneurship that it becomes very attractive to people. But to your point, I think the ones that are the best, the ones that have been most successful comes from solving a problem. So they're not the manufactured pop, it is the ones that have longevity, they're solving a real problem.
Yeah. But, I just want to reflect on what Gina was saying, right? It is the businesses that perhaps women start, or folks from an underrepresented community, right? That isn't your pop star, correct? The businesses they start, it becomes difficult in the first place to explain the purpose to someone across the table who has just never been there before, right? So if you're talking to, 50-year-old white men or, 50-year-old Asian men, they are coming from a very, very different mindset, very, very different background. They've never faced, the challenges that Gina is trying to solve. right? And therefore, the color of capital needs to change as well, right? Which is where we started this conversation. People on the other side need to recognize that this is a problem worth solving, and they can recognize that when they've faced it, right?
I think that's a really good point. And right now, with everything that's terrible about the pandemic outbreak, one of the things that is helping us, I think, make a point about our solution is that we've been talking about flexible and remote work since 2013, 2014, and advocating for this. And a lot of companies are not interested in offering flexible and remote work. They just don't have the setup, they don't have the process, they don't have the know-how, and a million other excuses. And it's proven, and there are stats that show that if you give women access to flexible and remote work, they stay in the workforce. There are more women in management, and there's overall better productivity and better diversity in companies. And yet companies won't do it because it's too hard. But what's happening now is everyone is forced to work remotely. And so all of a sudden, companies are realizing that it is actually possible to have this type of setup. But the challenging thing that's happening right now, of course, is that schools are closed and there's disruption. And so therefore, it isn't a typical remote work environment where women can thrive, because unfortunately they have all the other COVID-related household matters to deal with.
Right. But baby steps, right? I think, in the Googles or the Microsofts of the world can declare flexibility and work from home. It just makes you question why they never did it earlier, right? So, when men and women face the same problem, then it becomes a leveler.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, because I think the trend towards remote working and flexi working, we were starting to trend towards that, right? And it's always, to Gina's point, it expands just the opportunity for different people to work in a much more democratized working environment, be it kind of moms who are carers or differently abled people. So then with the pandemic, of course, we've accelerated this trend. But I think the call out was that before the pandemic, remote work was intentional, right? So people chose it because they knew how to kind of navigate it. It fit with their life, but there were fewer rules. And then with the pandemic, suddenly everybody had to work from home. I think what changed was people realized that, and when I say people, it's individuals and businesses as well, realize that, hey, we can all work from home and continue to be productive and successful. But I don't know whether I'm being pessimistic, but I think that in order for that trend to continue, outside of the pandemic, hopefully a year from now, we're no longer in a pandemic, but people can still continue to work from home, is that it has to evolve, right? Because with the pandemic, people didn't choose to work from home. So it happened at global scale. It happened to all of us. So when people start to have the ability to choose to go back, I think that mindset shift still has to continue, because as managers, as businesses, as employers, we'll need to know, hey, this is about giving people flexibility. The other thing is on the individual side, we were forced to kind of do it, so we adapted. But I think with that disruption, people are starting to question, do I want remote work? And it's taking a real toll on kind of work-life balance and so forth. So I think there's some questions. I think by and large, it's great because there is a shift in mindset that this can happen, but there are other things that we need to, other factors that we need to work on so that this can be a long-term trend and not in response to something so immediate.
Betty, what can tech do there? What are you seeing as a path-breaking product, services that are coming out that actually take the judgment out of remote work?
Yeah, the remote work, it's the world, like the pandemic is putting us in the largest experiment, right? Imagine if everyone couldn't come to work. All right, great. We're in this for a few months. I think on the investment perspective, it's quite interesting. We invested in like collaboration tools. For instance, like a company, it's actually an Argentine company called Murally that does a lot of online collaboration because like most of the video doesn't represent, like I think the challenge is we're taking our regular life and I would say, all right, now just go online, right? So you need to ensure that the systems and the tools are there. So they built that out in 2002, and then it was like growing, but not significantly. And then during pandemic, they raised like 100 million. So because there's a true shift into people trying to see if we wanted to go fully online, just joining Zoom, that's not enough, right? So there's a lot of changes on the work schedule, because people might be in different time zones. So people might be waking at 5:30 to like run a panel, for instance. And then I think we'll need to find like better adjustments into people's life, and then also find different tools that make it a lot more engaging, right? Because otherwise we go into like a fatigue, into like, this is something we're trying to adapt, but we're also trying to expel as soon as things come back.
All right. Okay. So as we wind this down and we have a couple of minutes on the clock, we began with your personal stories, right? Of moments of leaps of faith, of courage, of doing something that was out of your comfort zone, but then again brought you back to your comfort zone, right? Made you recognize what really your comfort zone was all about. Um, just to close this off, I think we also touched upon the role that mentors and the role that role models can play in our lives, right? So I think to close this, I'd like for each of you to share an anecdote or a story from what has been a good outside influence and why that was an important influence in your careers. Any one of you can start.
I can go first. Sina, this is something that we actually talk about, particularly in the last year. I get asked a lot, either kind of in social conversations or at work, like how do you keep your spirits up, right, during this pandemic? And very frequently we end up talking about this. I just wanted to share that actually when I was back in the OTA startup, we had 1 year that was really difficult. A different type of terror from what we are experiencing right now. So our business was primarily European and Asia centric. And in 2004, for the people who are in Europe, you probably heard that, you probably know that Madrid had a series of bombings in April that year. So as a business, we were grappling with what does this mean for our customers, our community there. And then about half a year later, the Boxing Day tsunami actually happened. And it devastated some of the most beautiful places in Asia, in fact, in the world. And as we were just trying to kind of come out and learn how to manage that, about half a year later, the London bombings happened, right? So as a travel company, it was, of course, devastating to the business. We had a ton of cancellations, but more critically, our customers, our partners, and in fact, we have employees in these locations, right, were all impacted. And while we were a successful startup at that point, we were nonetheless a startup, right? And all the founding members, we were relatively new. It was all our first or second companies. And when you're in a leadership position, there are so many implications in terms of, we had about 100 people then, was, hey, could we survive this? And this was really a difficult challenge for us, but I wanted to say it was really about the team coming together. And we were really single-minded in our focus. So the team really rallied. The leadership team did, the entire group of all 100 of us just came together and rallied. We were single-minded. We wanted to focus on our teams and communities, and no job was too small. When things like that happen, whether it's natural or man-made disasters, the phones, the emails go off. We all have to do customer service. We all accepted cancellations without charge, just people coming together, working really long hours, being single-minded to help our teams and our community. And at the same time, we also was through that process trying to pivot the business and find light in a challenging time. We had to diversify, we had to go into other cities, other products. And I was very happy to say that, hey, this is a story of a fairy tale ending, because we all kept our jobs. In fact, we grew. By the time, in a year's time, we were about 2 or 3x, and we had a very good sale not long after. And for me, I was just in awe of everybody there. Like, everybody stood up. There was a real showcase of resilience and having a great team around to kind of really motivate, support, and inspire each other. So as I'm going through frequently now, I think about that time so I can lean in on that with kind of the team of people that we had that were all just keeping each other going. So hopefully sharing that so that it may be helping us with some of the situation that we're facing as well.
But Chloe, if I can ask you to reflect on what you think all of you as leadership did to inspire that team to come together, right? Because a situation like this can also lead to the organization crumbling. So, what was it about when you reflect back and think about as a leadership, what you all did to actually bring that resilience in, or the culture you built at the organization over a period of time, right?
Absolutely. I think the culture that we have was something that we deeply value. Everybody felt very invested in the company, and everybody felt very invested in the community and our customers. So we had a single-minded focus to go, hey, when this happened and everybody's impacted, right? And throughout the whole chain, our customers, our partners, our employees, what is the first thing that we needed to do? Very frequently, when there is a disaster or something comes up, the instinct for people is you start to fracture out. You start to come up with lots of ideas for very good purpose, and you start running to do things. And what we did was to go, we're not going to do 10 things, right? There's 2 things that we need to do. We need to help our community. There was a single-minded focus. And we said, these are the list of things that we're going to do to help them. The second thing was the business need to survive. So in order to survive, we had to pivot. We had to change our business from focus strictly on really key European and Asian markets to a much broader set of markets and products as well. So I think the single-minded focus was really important to bring people together. And we were very fortunate because we were essentially a big family and everybody felt very invested in the community and helping the business get through this.
All right. Betty, for you?
Yeah, and the question on role model is really interesting. I think very often we get asked, how do you balance work life or being a mom or doing this and doing that? And I think I have a really good role model, which is 500 CEO. It's a she, right? It's Christine. And like you often think like, you have to find like the best balance, or it needs to be like the strongest outgoing decision that you look on TV. And it's she is just who authentic person she is. So she's mom of 2 kids, and then she's balancing. She's on the call, and then you ask her, and she'll tell you, I'm not balancing it. I'm just trying to survive on both. But it's when you are going through that, it seems hard. But you look back, there's so much change that like she impacted to the team, right? So I think it just helped reflect. Often we always think that the role model needs to be something we read or something we watch on TV, or someone that you have to say, oh my God, this person is perfect. And I think she brings this human, like unlimited amount of empathy that is a superpower, right? But you often think like it's the result, it's the next thing by end of the year that should be, and the outgoing, the shouting, the pounding the table person that should be, and that's not who she is, and that's not the culture that she's bringing into the organization. And I find that very inspiring because I often think that or at least I was brought up in a very business male success-like framework. So if I need to succeed, I need to look like them. I need to be really strong. I need to be a visionary. I need to know everything. I need to be perfect. And then Christine shows me like, no, her empathy can actually change and affect what we want to do, right? So it's just been a role model in her own way of being, and it's been a pleasure to be part of the organization.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm hearing there is also each of us, whether you're a man or a woman, just bringing your full life, right? I don't think you can divorce your work and your life. And I think everyone recognizing, and I think maybe the pandemic has helped us do that, right? Recognize that there are lives over here that go beyond the 9 to 5, and how we can bring more of our full self to our work or to our life makes all the difference, right? You need buy-in from your family, and I think when they can see what you do, they realize how important it is to you, right? And I think for too long we've kept, tried to keep those two strongly apart. I don't think it can be done. So I totally get where Christina is coming from. And for you, Gina?
So I'm half Filipino, half British, and similar to Betty, I've experienced this sort of cross-cultural situation. But my mom was actually one of the first domestic workers who went from the Philippines, from a really small remote town, to the UK, back in the early days when Filipinos were first going abroad to work, as domestic staff. And she was an entrepreneur. I mean, Filipinos celebrate our overseas workers, but I don't think they recognize that entrepreneurship spirit. Definitely, I got my entrepreneurial gene from my mom. I mean, it was just so brave of her to go out and do this in those days when we didn't have FaceTime and Zoom and all these different ways to connect. And I think that, I look at Filipinos, and Filipino as a people are so resilient. I mean, this year we've been hit with 21 typhoons, and the year is not even done yet. And this last one was a tragedy. I mean, whole cities, went underwater. And so it's been heartbreaking. But that spirit of just getting back up and doing it again is something that I really, it really inspires me. I spent most of my life outside of the Philippines, and I spent some time in Singapore as well. And I've met Filipinos everywhere, right? Like Filipino helpers, Filipino maids, Filipino nursing staff, and a lot of them sacrifice to leave the country. I don't think I've met any Filipino who wants to leave the Philippines. Filipinos are very family oriented. We love our homes, our food, and our communities. But a lot of the time, and it's especially for me heartbreaking as a mom when I see the Filipino moms who have to leave their kids behind just because they have to make the sacrifice because there's no job opportunities back home. So, that's what inspired me in 2016 to say to my husband, I've been working with women entrepreneurs all over the world, empowering them through tech. Maybe it's time that we went back to the Philippines and did something for Filipino women. And thanks to my husband, I have to say, those male supporters in our lives and the husbands and family members, he said, when do you want to go? And I said, let's go now. And that was on Wednesday, and by Friday, he quit his job as a CTO of a clean energy company in Singapore. And within a couple of months, we were back here. So
That's wonderful. Truly the wind beneath your wings, Gina. And I think we all need those individuals. We all need that support in our life, right? And I'm sure. All right. So, on that wonderful note, thank you, Betty. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Chloe, for joining us at Switch 2020 today and talking to us about what it means to be in business as a woman. And I hope for everyone who listened in, there were enough takeaways from this. And thank you very much.